to our second interview in this series of interviews with Hymn Society leaders. My name is Mike McMahon, and I'm here today with Dr. Mary Louise Bringle, known to most of us as Mel. Mel is professor of philosophy and religion and chair of the interdisciplinary studies program at Brevard College in Brevard, North Carolina. She studied in the United States and France, then went on to do her PhD at Emory University. Her scholarly works include 3 books on the 7 cardinal or deadly sins, and she has applied those deadly sins to some contemporary life situations. The 3 books that she has done feature despair, gluttony, and envy. Mel is best known to Hymn Society members and friends as a prolific writer and translator of hymns, including 2 full-blown collections of her own texts. She chaired the Presbyterian Committee on Congregational Song, which over a 5-year process produced Glory to God, the official hymnal of the Presbyterian Church USA. She served as president of the Hymn Society from 2008 until 2010. She's been a longtime member and has presented both as a plenary speaker and as a hymn festival leader. So Mel, it's so great to welcome you and to have this chance to talk together.
Thank you, Mike. I'm honored beyond words to be one of the few interviewees in this 100 years of song. So thank you.
Well, it's great to have you. So I'd like to start out by asking you about your early life and how congregational song might have played a role when you were growing up.
I grew up in the Presbyterian Church. At that time, it was the Presbyterian Church US, prior to reunion becoming the PCUSA. And my earliest memories of congregational song are being taken to audition for a children's choir at First Presbyterian Church in Greensboro, North Carolina. Not auditioning in terms of voice quality, but just can you match pitch? Is this tone higher or lower? And sitting on the piano bench next to the new young choir director, fresh out of Union Seminary in New York, whose name was Franklin Pethel. And I was a little intimidated by the process, but he asked me some question about, when is your birthday? And my birthday and his birthday turned out to be the same day. And I was instantly in love and enraptured with him. And I sang in his children's choirs, primary choir, junior choir, on up all the way through high school, and really got my education in church music in that way.
So would you say that he is maybe your biggest early influence in the area of congregational song?
Absolutely. He is the person who helped me learn how to read music, how to sing parts, what the church's song is, how song weaves into a worship setting. I mean, I hung on his every word and admired his talents so much. And ultimately, when I started writing hymns, William Rowan did me the great honor of naming one of his hymn tunes after him. So there is now a tune named Pethel that appears in One Lord, One Faith, One Baptism. And I'm really pleased to further his legacy in that way.
That's cool. You know, I'm really struck at that experience because you had told me earlier that you were more the text writer, theologian, not the musician, and yet your early experience was of singing in a choir.
That's true. I think I have just enough musical background that I can sight read a hymn or the alto line in a not terribly difficult anthem. And I think one of the gratifying things about hymnody for me when I made the turn to focus on hymnody was that I, as a bear of very little brain or a musician of very little talent, could still take a hymn and take it to the piano and play it and have something that sounded quite lovely. So hymnody is right at the level of my musical abilities. But in terms of texts, I would say the bigger influence is my father, who had the reputation of knowing every stanza of every hymn in the hymnal by heart, so that he never had to look at the book when he sang. And we would sing hymns on family trips, and we would do family devotions on my parents' bed in the morning and would sing hymns and read scripture. So all that's in the background, along with a distant great grandfather on my mother's side, known as Daddy Kutz, who was the song leader at his local Methodist church and was notorious for making the congregation stop and start over again if they were not singing enthusiastically enough.
Wow, that is really intense.
Yes, indeed.
I was reading that when you write a new text, you often start with a tune. I think that's interesting. That was really interesting to me because I'm not sure that's a very typical kind of way of going about writing texts.
I think it is probably atypical. It's in part because I love to piggyback off the talents of other people. And often I may not have anything particular to say until I hear a piece of music that pulls words out of me. So I really owe my life as a hymn writer to William Rowan at a workshop for hymn writers held by the Hymn Society on the campus of Boston University in the summer of 2000. And I had just written a few texts prior to that point, but he had embarked on this project of writing hymns without words. He wanted to see as a composer what it was like to try to write to a certain dance form or metric style and not have any preconception about the words. And he brought this collection of HWWs, hymns without words, to all of us at the workshop. And I found myself enchanted with the idea of just using music that hadn't been worded before and seeing what I could do with it. So after that summer workshop, I took that collection home with me and really worked at writing a hymn a week until I had written words for all of those tunes that he had created.
And was that the way you got started in writing texts?
That was the way I got started in earnest. I had done a few texts before that. I had had an invitation from a former student to write a hymn text for his wedding as a wedding present out of the blue. Except that I realized after the fact that that student had been in a class I taught on church history when I taught certain heresies by making up hymns for heretics. And so we sang, "Hark, docetic Christians sing, only glory suits a king, veiled in flesh, the Godhead see, feigning full humanity." So he knew I could write metric verse, and I guess he thought if I could write fake hymns, I could write real ones. So I wrote that text for him and had the experience of hearing it sung and getting so high on that experience that I thought I wanted to do more of it. And so I met Sally Morris, thereby hangs a long tail, but she said, if you want to write more hymns, you should join the Hymn Society. And I did. And that's what led to my attending that workshop, which really turned my life. My life goes in one trajectory up to the summer of 2000, and then it turns a corner and is completely diverted by hymnody. So it's been a good turning.
I also read that you had won a couple of competitions early on in your hymn writing career.
That was the odd thing. Sally said to me when we met outside my office at St. Andrew's Presbyterian College, she said, if you want to move forward in the hymn world, you should join the Hymn Society and you should enter some of their competitions, which was fascinating because I didn't know hymn writing was a competitive sport. But I signed on to the Hymn Society website. I saw 3 competitions advertised. I entered all 3 and month after month after month received notice that I had won all 3. So that seemed like confirmation that maybe this was something that I should try to do more of. I still was not convinced until at that summer workshop in Boston, William Rowan took me aside and he said, you really need to think seriously about what you're going to do with your life when you get back home. Because I was working on one of those Deadly Sin books, and that Deadly Sin book went into a dresser drawer and sat there for about 10 years while I entered the hymn world and took seriously what he had said and let my life be transformed.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. I wonder if we could go back for just a second to the
Sure.
using music as an inspiration for text. I wonder,
Mhm.
do you have an example of how a text came to you from a tune?
Oh, sure. I mean, I've got multiple examples. The one that I tell most often is the hymn Light Dawns on a Weary World, which is one that I wrote at a Hymn Society conference in Independence, Missouri in the summer of 2001, because I met William Rowan again at that conference. And he said, I've written a tune that you're going to love. And we looked all over the Temple of Peace there from the Community of Christ to find a room with an open piano. And he played the hymn for me. And there was a little part in the left hand that was a descending scale that sounded to me like running water, like a flowing garden, like rivers and water and greenness. And so when I went back to my hotel room at the Red Roof Inn that night, I pulled out, God bless the Gideons, the Bible that was in the bedside table. And I knew that imagery of watered gardens appeared in the latter part of the book of Isaiah. So I flipped to Isaiah and I started looking for that imagery of the watered garden. And I came to that section of you shall go out in joy and be led forth in peace. The hills and the mountains before you will break forth into song, and all the trees of the field will clap their hands. And those lyrics fit perfectly with the refrain motif of that piece of music that's now called Temple of Peace in honor of the Community of Christ, where the hymn was born. So that's how one musical motif will give rise to an image that will then bring in scripture and take sometimes maximal, sometimes minimal crafting to get the idea to fit with the tune.
That's pretty cool. I think your hymns are appearing in all of the major hymnals these days. I'm wondering if there's one hymn that you're particularly pleased with that people are singing out there.
I have been surprised at the number of people who sing When Memory Fades, which is a hymn text I wrote very early. I mean, it's probably the second or third text I ever wrote in honor of a friend whose mother was in late stages Alzheimer's. And it really felt like such a personal and in some ways idiosyncratic text to me that it did not occur to me it would get picked up by denominational hymnals. But it's now the hymn of mine, I think, that is most widely sung. It's certainly the one about which I get the most email and correspondence.
I can speak personally that is a very powerful text. In fact, I was at a funeral just this past Friday at which it was sung. Deb Loftus's mother died about 2 weeks ago. And at the funeral service last Friday, of the 4 hymns that were sung at that service, that was one of them because her mother had experienced memory loss during the final years of her life. And Deb spoke of that in her remarks. And then when we sang that hymn, wow, that was just such a powerful moment. So I'm sure others have had similar kinds of experiences to hear a hymn that is so closely linked to an experience that so many of us have had with others. And I guess that's just reminds me of something about your hymns, that they relate to experiences that people have. It sort of reminds me of what we were saying about your work on the deadly sins, that you've applied them to contemporary life, and it seems you've done a lot of the same thing with your hymns.
I think perhaps I can only write words when music has moved me to the words. And so the music gets credit for creating an affect that then becomes an emotional and spiritual place out of which I write. So when the words and the music come together, I sometimes call it the tear test. If I'm in tears by the end of writing a particular passage, then I feel as if the hymn speaks to my experience, and that's a pretty good guarantee that it will speak to at least someone else's experience as well.
Now, another thing that you've done along the way is that you chaired the committee that produced Glory to God. And I'm just curious to hear you talk a little bit about that experience, what it was like to, work with a lot of other people and produce a collection of hymns that were not your own.
First, I will say that was a once in a lifetime experience. And I mean both parts of that phrase. It was a great joy and honor to do it, and once is enough. I marvel at people like Sam Young who can do that on repeated occasions. It is very, very demanding work, a splendid opportunity. I mean, a marvelous opportunity. It also made me stop writing for a period of at least 5 or 6 years. It's very hard, or I found it hard, to even think about creating a hymn text of my own when I was reading so many from other people, and even got to a point where I thought, here are all of these amazing hymns in the world. Does the church really need any more? When you keep looking at text after text after text, and only 8% of the things that we look at get included in the collection. Does one really want to continue this proliferation? And so I write much less now than I used to. And part of that, I think, is having the honor of reading so many other people's work and seeing how much is available. It was a bit like, it was a bit like herding stray creatures, each of whom has a mind of its own. That was the beauty of the committee, was that people had diverse views and diverse likes. And I think there was a compelling moment for each of us when we sort of came to the realization, oh, this hymnal is not for me. This hymnal is for a denomination of people, some of whom think like me and sing like me, and many of whom don't. And when that realization began to dawn around the room, I think some of us got down off high horses, whether textually or musically or liturgically, and began to be much more open to a kind of breadth of possibilities.
Interestingly, David Eicher is in attendance at this recording that we're doing right now, and I know that he worked. He was like the project director, right?
Yes, editor. Yes,
the editor. So you all were a team, and I will just say that for me, Glory to God is just a great gift to the whole church, not just to the Presbyterian Church USA, because it's provided a resource that is much more widely used than in the Presbyterian Church. So thank you for that gift.
We are glad to have it in the world.
Indeed. So I'd like to turn to the Hymn Society and ask you a little bit about, you talked about how you first got involved in the Hymn Society, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it's been like to be a part of this organization, this community really of people who are into congregational song.
It is a splendid community. I'll pull upon some of my work on envy. And one of my favorite quotes that I found when I was working on the envy book is Gregory the Great, who says, "Those things are ours which we admire in others." And so the greatest antidote for envy is admiration. And in the Hymn Society, there is a community of extraordinarily talented people, whether they be scholars or musicians or composers or text writers. And not a single person lords it over anyone else, although many of them have due cause to do so. But it really is a place where people rejoice with others who rejoice, and experience other people's gifts as their own, and celebrate each new wonderful text that comes into the world as a gift to the world of song. So I have really been blessed by being part of a professional community that is completely non-envying and mutually supportive. I wish that for the rest of the world.
I have to say, for me too, it's an extraordinary experience really to be involved with a group in which collegiality really takes flesh. I hear people talk about collegiality, but in the Hymn Society, I've certainly experienced it at an amazing level. John Thornburg talks about how the Hymn Society is non-competitive and collegial. And that certainly is very true. And of course, you're a great example of that yourself. I mean, you give freely of your gifts to others.
Well, I think part of it, I mean, I'm not sure, Mike, but it has occurred to me along the lines that hymn writing or congregational songwriting is often a highly collaborative activity. Now, granted, there are those extraordinarily gifted singer-songwriters who can do both words and music. But most of us who write text depend upon a composer to give it voice. And most of us who write music depend upon a text writer to give it meaning. And the product doesn't happen without a meeting of the minds. So I'm wondering if people who enjoy that kind of collaborative spirit are drawn to the Hymn Society, or if the Hymn Society helps collaborators find one another and create a community where their gifts can enrich each other.
Yeah, I suspect it's a little of both. Huh? I wonder, you were president of the Hymn Society for a couple of years. Were there any highlights to that time in leadership?
It was an interesting time. It was a time when the Hymn Society needed someone in the presidency who could make trains run on time. And so, I'm not a visionary leader, but I'm pretty good at setting up processes and making sure things happen. So at the time that I was to take over was the time when Carl Dahl was stepping down as executive director, and we needed to run a search and hire a new ED. So as someone who has chaired divisions at liberal arts colleges for decades, and running a search committee was a fairly familiar process, and setting up a budget and doing interviews and all of that. So I think the great highlight of my tenure was that we successfully negotiated Carl Dahl's retirement and Deb Loftus's advent as our next executive director. And I feel very good about both of those things. I think Carl left an amazing legacy to the society. We're so in his debt for all of the creative leadership that he brought, all the marvelous programs that he put together. And we are also in Deb Loftus's debt for coming on board and helping us move into a more digital age, move into a more aggressive fundraising era, companioned with John Thornburg as the next president, sort of moving us in the direction of seeing broader horizons and really making more stable our path into the future.
Yeah, I kudos to you on both of those things. Also, I have to say, is now being the executive director, it's kind of daunting to look back to people who've done this before me and to walk in their footsteps. I mean, there's some incredibly talented, gifted, and generous people who have done this job in the past. It's great. So, what kinds of changes have you seen in the Hymn Society that have struck you as we have moved past over these years that you've been involved?
Well, I think Sui Hong spoke about some of these in his last interview. And by the way, I was reading the closed captions just because I sometimes like to do that when I keep up with an interview. And the closed caption could not handle the name Sui Hong, so it turned him into Sweetheart. So every time you addressed him, it sounded as if you were saying, "So, Sweetheart, what do you think about it, direct?" So I'm not sure how my name will come out.
That seems very appropriate, though.
I think I have seen an increasing focus on the practical in addition to the theoretical. I think there is still splendid scholarship that is done, but there has also been a much more concerted effort to have regular practitioners' workshops for song leading and text writing and tune composing. There has certainly been a vastly expanded repertoire of the kinds of music that we sing. There has been a diminution of the graying and an advent of a wonderful cadre of younger scholars and practitioners, especially through the Loveless community, though not exclusively. There has been an outreach toward more and more global song, and in something that is just beginning, and I hope will move further, a move beyond ecumenical hymnody to interfaith song and praise and worship. So I think our circles of concern keep growing broader and broader and broader.
think that kind of raises the question of, what is the undone work that you see before us?
Well, part of the undone work is continuing to let more and more of the world know of the done work that we're doing. I think more and more people who are aficionados of congregational song need to become part of the society, because they would find a community of great blessing to them. But I think also, just generally speaking, our theological fringes need to move even further. So again, interfaith hymnody, but also sort of, this will sound silly, but interspecies. I mean, I'm really concerned increasingly in my own writing and my own scholarship about the anthropocentric bias of our hymnody. Now, I mean, obviously we're human beings, so we sing from a human perspective, but it's one thing to sing from your perspective looking out onto the rest of the world. It's another thing to sing from your perspective encapsulated on those just like you. So I'm hopeful that we can widen our theology, generally speaking, in the Christian world, in the world of religious faith, and widen our song so that we make ourselves ever more attentive to what some scholars in environmental theology call the voices of other kind.
You raised these issues in your last plenary address to us in Dallas, and that was a very, very powerful address. And as a result, the executive committee decided to run a hymn search based on some of the suggestions that you made about things that are missing in our repertoire of texts. I was wondering what that was like for you to see a competition based on your ideas.
Well, I mean, it's very flattering that people listen that closely. It's also a little scary that people listen that closely. But I, as a text writer, am always grateful when someone says, here's a need. Because when you see the plethora of texts already available, there's really not much need to write a text unless it's filling a need that hasn't yet been met. And if someone will say to me, we need songs about mental illness, we do. We don't have many in our corpus that deal with those issues. So I thought it might be a reciprocal gift I could give to my text writing friends out there to say, here are some areas I think that need to be represented better in hymnody. So have a go at it and see what you come up with. And subsequently, I may have taken that charge upon myself as well. So finally, this summer, I got around to writing the hymn text for the funerals of companion animals, because I have long thought this is a gap in the repertoire. If we can sing our beloved human companions into their next life, why can't we do the same for those other than human companions who have been, in some instances, even more close to us? So I finally wrote a text along those lines, and God bless Sally Morris. She took the text and gave it an absolutely lovely setting that we have named Hiker after one of her beloved companion animals who's passed.
Cool. Are you working on any other projects in terms of hymn writing?
I am. I'm working on a talk that I will be giving this spring, carrying this idea forward, called Creature Canticles. It just struck me as very odd. If you run through the text of all creatures of our God and King, the creatures mentioned are sun and moon and earth and fire, which in the 13th century, that was a meaning of the word creature. It was anything created by God, but it's not the critters. There are not all critters of our God and King. The four-leggeds and the two-leggeds and the wingeds are vastly underrepresented in hymnody. So one of my current research projects is to find where they are represented and to try to find new texts that people have written. So if any of you out there are writing texts about other than human animals, I would love to see them. Dan Damon has just sent me a few, and God bless Dan Damon for his creativity.
That is really neat. You are not only been a leader in the Hymn Society, you also have been a big supporter of the Hymn Society yourself. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how people can help the Hymn Society continue to do what it does.
Many of us in the Hymn Society are not people of great means. we work at small churches, we teach at small colleges, we do what we can with what we earn. But it occurred to me several years ago that I would not be getting a penny in royalties for hymns I write were it not for the Hymn Society, which has promoted me and encouraged me and developed me as a text writer. So I started annually tithing my royalties from GIA. And that's just something that it has occurred to me is good to do, but even better, I have now written the Hymn Society in my will. I don't have heirs to whom I need to leave a legacy. So Bob Battistini said to me way long time ago when he was offering GIA to be my publisher, he said, one of the advantages of having a publisher is that we can handle your hymn estate for you. Well, I was 40 years old at the time. I wasn't really thinking about estates, but as I have gotten older, it has occurred to me, I would really like for that annual check from GIA to go to good purposes. And since I don't have a family to whom to bequeath that, I will bequeath it to my broader and beloved hymn family. And I think that's a simple thing for people who have some kind of income from writing, from royalties, that we can do to promote the longevity of the society that has meant so much to us.
I've noticed that there are a number of members have included the Hymn Society in their wills. In fact, this past year, we received a pretty sizable bequest from the estate of Doja Carlson. Mm-hmm. She also was, wrote a lot of hymns. Now, she didn't structure quite the same way that you're talking about, but I think probably the main point is, you do what works for you, and what matches your own life situation. But to be able to provide ways for the Hymn Society to continue to do what it does, I think is a really, really wonderful thing, and something we're going to be working on in the future as we continue to develop the support for the Hymn Society. I want to raise one more question though before we wrap up. And David Eicher wrote in the chat that he'd like to hear you talk a little bit about your work in translating hymns. So could you talk a little bit about your work as a translator?
I would love to talk about my work as a translator. This again is the genius of Bob Battistini, about whom one cannot say enough. Executive director, editor emeritus of GIA Publications, who came over to me. I think I was standing with my suitcase waiting for the bus to take me back to the airport at some Hymn Society summer conference, and said, "Have you ever done any translating?" And I had a little bit, and I said, "Well, yeah, some." So he said, "Well, would you consider working on some translations for us?" Little did I know that he didn't mean 2 or 3, he meant closer to 200 or 300. But it is fun for me because, one, I love to piggyback off of other people's creativity. So if there's a composer who's written a great tune, I like for that to inspire me. If there's a text writer in another language who has written a great text, I like to be able to render it for others. Translation for me is like solving word puzzles. It's like verbal Sudoku. So you have to have these meanings, but it has to fit this meter, and you have to manage a rhyme here and here. So maybe you can't end your sentence with the same word that the original did. Maybe you need to put that word in the middle of the next sentence and pull something else out that has a better rhyming option in English. So it's really a sort of game for me. It's intellectual play. So, whenever I would get a new sheaf of text to translate, it was like, oh boy, I've got more recreation for a rainy weekend.
Well, I've enjoyed singing some of your translations of Spanish hymns particularly, and I'm always struck. My husband is a professional translator from Spanish to English, interestingly, and he has liked your translations also. That they seem to capture the spirit of what's being expressed in the Spanish, as well as the words.
Well, again, that's the gift of the music. Because my Spanish is not that good. I mean, my French is much better, and I can read the Spanish and kind of make sense of it. But what gives it the affective quality is that the words have to fit to the same tune. And my training as somebody who writes text for pre-existing tunes really comes in handy, because now I can get the general idea of the original. get the affective tone and mood from the music, and then mesh those things in a translation that I hope sings as well as the original sings, even though it may not say exactly what the original says.
Cool. Well, one last question, and that is, if you had like one fond hope for the Hymn Society in the years to come, what would that be?
You know, it really goes back to something I've already said, Mike, and it's that I would like not so much for the Hymn Society to be any different, but for the world to become more like the Hymn Society. And in that regard, I guess it's incumbent upon us to make sure that more of the world knows about who we are and what we do, so that they can join in and carry that pattern of non-competitive, collaborative, creative joy into the rest of what we do.
Well, thank you so much. We are so fortunate to have you as a colleague and a leader and a supporter, and that you've shared your gifts so generously with all of us over these years.
It has been life-changing, and I'm very glad.
Mel, thank you so much for our conversation today. I've really enjoyed it, and I'm sure everybody who's watching today is enjoying it as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Take care. Bye, everybody.